Howdy, with this video, want to go over the schedule, then go over essay number one, make sure you understand what I'm looking for there. I'm doing this video on Sunday, June 19th. For tomorrow, response number 6 is due. One final response before we get to the essay. Then the essay comes pretty quickly. On Thursday, the 23rd, I'm looking for the first 2 paragraphs. I should see your definition of the movement and your thesis statement. And I'll just mainly making sure you're on the right track. I'm not going to nitpick every little possible error or anything. Just want to make sure you're on the right track. It's kind of a check-in phase. Then on the 27th, the full draft of the essay is due. I'll assign peer reviews. I'll give you 2 other drafts to read, and you'll try and help each other out. Those will be due on the 30th. Then you'll get those back, and then the final version of essay number 1 is due on July 4th. Obviously, you can turn this in early if you want to, if you're busy on the 4th of July. Then after that, we get into some longer readings, The Dollhouse and Lulu and New, so make sure you're kind of looking ahead there. A Dollhouse is a full-length 3-act play. It takes a little while to read it and figure it out. And of course, you have Lulu and New there, graphic novel. Again, both of these are going to take a little while to read. That's why there's not a whole lot due, and the response is probably not quite as involved as the previous ones. Alrighty. I got lots of things opened up here. To see the contents for essay number 1, you're going to come to the content page and come over here to material for essay number 1. You're going to see several documents. One's the actual essay assignment itself. Then there's a separate sheet for the possible topic choices. There's a fiction terms list. Then there's just a handout of what all those fiction terms mean. Then there's a sample essay. And then there's some of the readings for the assignment. So let's go to the essay assignment. I already got it pulled up here. So essay number 1, you're going to notice pretty quickly this is a formulaic essay. I'm looking for something very specific in each paragraph. So make sure you put what I want in each paragraph, right? But you're going to write a 6-paragraph literary research essay. It should be a minimum of 1,000 words. Should be using MLA formatting. And you're going to use one topic on the given topic sheet, which we'll look at here in a second. Your essay is going to utilize at least 2 sources other than your textbook, dictionaries, encyclopedias, or class lectures. You should try to employ .edu sites whenever possible. And to do that, say you want to research American modernism. Well, you got to spell American right there. To limit it to .edu sites, you go site, .edu, and that will limit your Google search to sites with .edu in their name. You can kind of see going down there. You don't have the Wikipedia, Spartan Notes, stuff like that usually. Doesn't mean they're good sources, but it's one way to kind of limit the search a little bit so you're not going through 1,000 different websites. But you still have to go through the website and make sure you got a good source there. But within your essay, you're going to define a given literary movement, and this is kind of what we've been working towards, right? Our tradition, and then relate that movement to the short story that you choose in 3 ways. You're free to decide the work does not reflect a particular movement. We're working with a good man's hard to find for the next response. Flannery O'Connor kind of went head-to-head with some of these existentialists, and you can see some of it working into writing, but she's also rejecting some of the major ideas. Very interesting writer, responding to the ideas over time. So it doesn't have to be all or nothing. Somebody like Faulkner is kind of the American modernist. It's going to be hard to argue he's not a modernist. Just kind of depends on which story you get and which movement you choose. We'll look at the topic choices here in a second. But the basic way this essay is going to work, the first paragraph is just going to define the movement. You're probably not even going to mention the short story in your first paragraph. You're going to be using at least 2 or 3 sources to get a good definition of your movement. And by the end of that first paragraph, the reader should have a pretty good idea of what modernism or the Enlightenment or whatever movement you're working with actually entail. In other words, you're going to kind of become something of an expert on that particular movement, and then make sure you credit sources when you use them in that first paragraph as you define that movement. The second paragraph, you're going to briefly introduce the short story. 1, 2, 3 sentences at the most. This should be a very short paragraph. It'll tell us when it was written, who wrote it, and then you're going to get to your thesis statement saying, hey, this short story relates to my movement I defined in my first paragraph in 3 ways. And those 3 ways that you articulate in your thesis statement should come directly from that first paragraph. So if you don't have a very good definition going in your first paragraph, it's going to be hard to come up with a thesis statement where your 3 points come from that first paragraph, right? So that's why that first paragraph takes a little bit of work. And after that, it's kind of straightforward. You're going to spend a paragraph on each one of your thesis points. So if you're going to talk about fragmentation and modernism, you're going to show how fragmentation runs through that particular work and why that fragmentation is modernist in nature. Make sure you bring those body paragraphs back to the movement, right? Don't just say they're just as modernist because there's symbolism in all the movements. Why is this particular type of symbolism considered modern in nature? You should not have any research in those 3 body paragraphs. Don't be going to Schmoop or Spark Notes or whatever else is out there. This should be you looking at the story, relating the movement to the story. Giving it good examples, quotes from the story to show us where you're getting your ideas from. Your 6th paragraph should be your concluding paragraph. Do not repeat your thesis statement in the concluding paragraph. I know you do that for speech class, and some high school English teachers like to do that. You've been building towards your conclusion, and with humanities essays, that's what you're doing. You're building towards this conclusion, and you're ready to deliver the big bang, so to speak. And if you just repeat what you've already said, the reader's going to be like, well, I already read this. Why is this person repeating this to me? We'll talk about that a little more when we start getting into the drafts and stuff. Make sure you quote at least 3 times from the story in question. Make sure you have all this fun punctuation. There's on the help resources area of the content page, there's a handout there about the punctuation if you're not familiar with them. You should use at least 5 of the fiction terms on the literary fiction terms list. You don't have to define those terms in your essay, but you should use them properly. Just get used to using that vocabulary. And don't use any I, you, your, get, got, or it. Shouldn't be your name's on the essay, so you shouldn't have to say anything like, I think that, or something like that. It's pretty obvious it's your essay. Who else is doing the thinking there? So no real reason to use I. You don't want to shift to second person. Now, if you say something like, as a woman, you see how Zora Neale Hurston does this in her short story, I'm going to be like, hey, I'm not a woman. Sometimes that causes some problems with logic. You're assuming things about your reader. So just avoid that second person, no you or your. Avoid get or got. Those are vague verbs. I got a pizza. I got a boyfriend. I got COVID. There's much more precise verbs we can use. It's kind of a lazy verb we use, particularly when we're talking. Then we clarify as we keep talking. We don't have time for that in your essay. And just avoid it. You can always rewrite a sentence to get the word it out of there. If these words are in a quote, you can't help that, right? You can't help what other people say, but within your writing, you should avoid those words. There's kind of forbidden words. But you kind of see, kind of just a takeoff on that basic 5-part essay you probably learned in high school. We're adding a definition paragraph. So hopefully this might be kind of a familiar kind of formulaic format, but it doesn't mean the critical thinking is easy, right? When you get into the body paragraphs and you got to start relating the story to the movement, that can get kind of difficult. For the topic choices, you got quite a few to choose from. Kind of the best way to do it is you kind of found the movement, you're kind of like, hey, that's kind of interesting. You may not agree with it, but kind of want to look into it a little bit more. That's a good way to get started in an essay like this. The solutions, Abraham Williams. It's just like it says, it's a sermon. And he's talking about, our ability to choose how we live. And he's dealing with a lot of these Enlightenment ideas, but he's also kind of concerned about some of these deists kind of throwing out the baby Jesus with the bathwater. So he's kind of in the middle of this, these ideas, and he's trying to work it all out. Very interesting work. Not easy to read, but awfully interesting if you're into that kind of thing. Nat Turner, The Confessions of Nat Turner. Nat Turner led a slave rebellion in the 1830s. This can be a little rough. There's lots of violence in it. In the rebellion, they killed 52 white people. and the confessions discuss how he did that. And also, he's not very apologetic either. So it's a fascinating reading. You're going to see he's motivated because he kind of thinks God has told him to do this. So we kind of get into that question of, does this internal subjective truth, what happens if it starts telling you to do certain things, like it did Nat Turner? Fascinating thing to read, and also just the way history has handled Nat Turner. Now he's almost pretty much a hero. Some of these Confederate statues that are being taken down, they're putting images of Nat Turner back up. So it's kind of interesting there. Nathaniel Hawthorne, if you liked the Birthmark, you'll like The Artist of the Beautiful. That highly symbolic, that the very, the ornate sentence, the complex sentences, that desire to take you to another place and play with your emotions. That's Nathaniel Hawthorne. Oh, sorry, I didn't highlight it there. If you hated the Birthmark and hate that symbolism, you're not going to like The Artist of the Beautiful. William Faulkner, Barn Burning. Watch out, there's some racist language in there, just like there was with the other Faulkner story. He's writing about, the South in the early 20th century. You're going to get that kind of language. A little more subtler than maybe Rose for Emily, but another good short story of his. Probably see those American modernist techniques at play there. Zora Neale Hurston, you do the Gilded Six Bits. Very good short story writer, writing during the Harlem Renaissance, that flowering of African American literature in the 1920s. But she was also fighting against some of particularly the male leaders of the movement. You're going to see she writes how she was an anthropologist by training. She's going to write how she heard people talking, particularly in the South, particularly African Americans in the South, and some of the particularly male writers in Harlem were saying, we want to uplift the African American culture, and she's like, that's exactly what I'm doing. There's nothing wrong with my culture. I don't need to uplift what's already up. And they kind of fought like this. But anyway. You also see she's also working with some of these modernist ideas. So you're going to pick either one or the other. Don't try and do the Harlem Renaissance and American modernism, where you're going to have a 5,000 word essay. You're going to pick either one of these movements. So when you start getting some of these choices down here, make sure you're picking one story and one movement. If you liked A Good Man's Hard to Find, you'll like Good Country People, that dark humor of Flannery O'Connor, that Southern Gothic kind of feel sometimes. But you can choose either the grotesque or existentialism. Grotesque, kind of taking the normal to the extreme and seeing what you get there, produces some very, very interesting works. But you can also see she's working within these existentialist ideas. Again, she may be one writer you say, well, she's kind of represents existentialist ideas in one way, but maybe not in this third way. You can argue that it's not all or nothing. You can argue that she's arguing against some of those ideas. Another good short story, Sonny's Blues by James Baldwin. Lots of interesting stuff going on there. African American writer. Does deal with drug addiction a little bit. But you can choose either existentialism or postmodernism for that excellent short story. I just reread that. He's a really good writer. Sherman Alexie, Native American writer. This is what it means to say Phoenix, Arizona. He has characters. Talking about what it means to be an indigenous person in the broader white culture, so to speak. And what that does to both the colonized and the colonizers. But he's a very modern writer as well. So he's working with all these different ideas. Kind of his question is, if you take away our culture and replace it with this postmodern kind of thing, thanks. What are we supposed to do with this, right? But you got to pick either one of those three. So don't try and do more than one movement. George Saunders, the 400-pound CEO. Missing a quote mark there. Kind of a depressing It's a funny but depressing postmodernist short story. With most of these stories, when you get into the first 3 or 4 paragraphs, if you just absolutely hate it, it's not going to get better, right? Move on to the next one. Jennifer Egan, Black Box. If you like those first 6 sections, you're like, wow, that's cool. I want to read the rest of it. By all means, read the rest of it and work with that in your first essay. But just the idea of sitting out, of creating a short story based on tweets, these fragments, right? And trying to, can't you unify these fragments into a coherent narrative? Or is it going to be kind of this postmodern kind of fractured kind of experience when reading it? And the last one, ZZ Packer, African-American female writer, writing, modern writer, short story Brownies. Again, another very, very interesting short story. Lots of interesting postmodernist, post-colonialist ideas taking place within there. But again, you got to choose either postmodernism or post-colonialism for that particular short story. So all these are good. If you want to kind of figure out which one you might prefer to work with or which one you'll hate the least, we'll see if you want to look at it that way. But again, my suggestion is if you found one of these movements kind of interesting and want to know more about them, and then it might be a good way to get into limiting which ones you actually want to work with. Alrighty. So that's the essay assignment. The literary fiction terms list is right here. Then there's a review of those fiction terms. Not too exciting. If some of you are like dual enrollment students, you might have just had all this stuff last year. Good for you. It's been a while since since a literature class. I might have to go back and read through some of these. But again, you're going to use these correctly in your essay. You don't have to define these in your essay. But once you start using the language of literature, so if instead of saying like the main character, I want to use the word protagonist. If you've got the second character in opposition to the first character, you got the antagonist. Just start using some of these terms, and it shouldn't be too hard once you get into it. Alrighty, one more thing. It's a good place to pause if you need a rest. I want to go over the sample essay, which I'm not sure where it's at. Hold on. There it is. That's up there too, under material for essay number 1. I'm not going to read this whole thing to you. You can read faster than I can talk. But just want to kind of go over what's happening in the essay so you can kind of see how your essay is supposed to work. This essay is going to be on Thomas Paine pamphlet, Common Sense. It was published independently. That's why it's in italics. All your short story titles are going to be in quotation marks, no italics. I never do both. There's no reason to do both at the same time usually. But you got to see with the first paragraph, I want you to define the movement. The movement he's going to work with is the Enlightenment. And that's all that's going to be happening in this first paragraph. You probably shouldn't even mention your short story or your work. You should just be defining the movement and getting a good comprehensive definition going in your first paragraph. And again, that's going to take a good, at least 2 or 3 sources probably, and you want to use the best sources you can. And you also want sources that actually talk about the literary side of the movement. If you just say, something like realism was a response to the Romantic movement, that's not going to help your essay, right? You want some specific literary qualities of the realist movement that you could use in your essay. One reason there's not anything about realism on topic sheets because you're going to be getting that with the second essay. So if you're like, well, what happened to the realists? We're going to get to them in terms of research and stuff like that. But here, the 18th century was a century of enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a movement in science, politics, religion, and literature that questioned virtually all accepted truth. Excuse me. Then he's going to start using sources. And start putting these together. Make sure you're introducing your sources. Make sure it's making grammatical sense. Those brackets show a change or addition the writer made to the quote, probably just to clarify something or make it grammatically similar with the rest of the sentence. But he's going to go through, use these sources. Notice getting into very specific things about the Enlightenment. We're going to see reason, science, respect for humanity. Notice he's doing a good job using these brackets to make sure his quotes make grammatical sense with the rest of the essay. Here we got a summary or paraphrase. This should be in his own words and sentence structure. Maybe it was a longer passage and he's like, I don't need all that I don't need a huge long quote in my essay. I'm just going to summarize it in my own words and sentence structure. That's perfectly fine, but you still have to cite that source there. But notice he's trying to get a pretty good definition of the movement going, using good sources. These ellipses, the 3 dots, show he's taking something out of a quote. Whether or not you put the brackets around these ellipses is kind of up to you. There's still a big debate within MLA formatting. If you get a bunch of English teachers, that's what we fight about. Makes it easier for me to search for your ellipses if you have them, but either way, with or without the brackets, is fine. But the 3 dots show that the writer's taking something out of the quote. But if you go back, read the whole thing, it's got a pretty good definition of the Enlightenment going there. Kind of ends his paragraph with his idea, just kind of maybe a brief, kind of a light summary of what just transpired there in that first paragraph. But that's what your first paragraph should look like. Whatever movement you're doing, you should develop a good definition of it using good sources. The second paragraph, you're going to introduce the work, then get to your thesis statement. This one's maybe just a little longer than most. Might have an extra sentence in there, but he's not padding his paper, so if it's a little over, that's fine. But sorry, I'm having some sinus stuff going on here. Of Enlightenment authors, Thomas Paine, author of Common Sense, is remembered as one of the most influential. His pamphlet was so popular that John Adams expected common sense to become the common faith of the people during the American Revolution. I didn't really want research in this one, but it's kind of short. It's kind of serving a purpose there. So he kind of asked me about it. I'm like, go ahead, leave it in there. But I don't want a big long biography of Thomas Paine or something like that. He's just kind of pointing out here this is kind of an important document. America was in need of a message that would galvanize the public at large and convince them of the benefits of independence from a tyrannical government, and common sense entered the scene at just the right time, which is absolutely true. In addition to being well known, Paine's work is a quintessential piece of Enlightenment literature and thought. So pretty good introduction to what common sense was and why it's kind of important. Then we get to our thesis statement. I want to see how this work, Common Sense, relates to Enlightenment in 3 ways. Same thing with your thesis. Whatever movement, whatever work you choose, you want to show me how that work's going to represent the movement in 3 ways. So here, common sense includes elements of almost every central idea of the Enlightenment, including those of logic and reason, toleration, and liberalism. And if I went back to that first paragraph, I'm going to see liberalism, toleration, or what the other one was, logic and reason, discussed in that first paragraph. These 3 points have to come from that first paragraph. You just can't pull them out of class lectures or out of thin air. So these first 2 paragraphs, these are kind of the hard, in my opinion, the harder part of the essay. That's why I want to see these first. If you have your first 2 paragraphs kind of in order, the rest of the essay kind of falls into place. Doesn't mean it's easy, but if something's wrong with these first 2 paragraphs, the rest of the essay is going to suffer a little bit for it. But then you're going to see he's going to develop each one of his thesis points. One concern with this particular thesis, this idea of liberalism, tends to mean something a little different today than it did back in terms of the Enlightenment times. The wind's blowing here. The very title of Thomas Paine's, so this third paragraph is going to be his first thesis point, right? Which would be logic and reason. The very title of Thomas Paine's Common Sense introduces the pamphlet as a piece of Enlightenment work. Right, common sense, logic, and reason. We can figure out how we're going to live and how we should live. It gets into the structure. I'm not going to read this whole thing. But make sure that's where you should start doing your own analysis and then using quotes to support what you're saying. Don't just give me a big long quote saying, and that's why it's the Enlightenment. It's like you got to show me the quote should support what you're saying about the work, not say it for you. Long quotes should only be tabbed once. That's why the comment's over there. Make sure you introduce quotes. Make sure you comment on quotes. If I had to complain about this draft, I'd say maybe a little too much reliance on longer quotes. Maybe it could use a little more commentary on the long quotes. But doing a pretty good job. Talking about logic and reason, how it runs through common sense, giving us examples. Then the next one, toleration. And that was a big thing in common sense. It's not like everybody in the Enlightenment area agreed with Thomas Paine here, but really promoted it quite strongly. A little bit of research here. He asked me ahead of time, so I kind of let him slide. It was short. Wasn't dominating the paragraphs, so I was like, all right, you got to have it in there, But generally, I don't want research in these body paragraphs. It should just be you, the work, and you quoting from the work to support what you're saying. And you can kind of see that's what he's doing. Again, kind of a long quote, could probably use a little more commentary on his part. Don't let the quotes do the work. Don't make me do the work. The reader do all the work by having to read all these long quotes. The quotes should just support what you're having to say. Then in the third paragraph, it's going to talk about liberalism. And like I said, probably needs to define it there. It shows what he's talking about, and there he goes. If you get into some of these postmodernist ideas like pastiche or the trace or something like that, you need to define what you think that means before you get going too far. But he talks about how that idea of limited self-government runs through common sense. There's the dashes. Whatever's inside the dashes, you can take them out of the sentence, and the sentence still makes sense. Basically, dashes function as parentheses. If you start using parentheses in a research paper, it looks like a citation. So sometimes dashes are a little bit better there. Then the conclusion paragraph. Kind of my complaint about this draft, and this was his original draft, but his final essay. It's a little short, kind of just repeating what he's already said. He's got a good ending line, but he could have developed that a little bit more. Tell us, what are we supposed to get out of this now? Why should we care about Thomas Paine and the Enlightenment? And your essay about it, basically. So make sure you kind of take us out to the big picture in your conclusion. Don't repeat what you've already said. He's got his works cited page there. Looks good. So that's what the essay should look like. Again, 6 paragraphs. Looking for very specific things in each paragraph. That was a word, wasn't it? So make sure you're meeting these guidelines. Define the movement first paragraph. Introduce the work briefly. And give your thesis in the second. Spend a body paragraph on each one of your 3 thesis points. Then a good concluding paragraph. Now, of course, it's easy for me to rattle that off. It's a lot harder to sit down and write it, right? But if you have any questions about the essay, be sure to let me know. And we'll definitely be talking to you later. Bye-bye.